All right, take three. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory. And today I'm talking about monsters with a special emphasis on female monsters. So there's a reason female monsters keep showing up in our stories. And yes, I know you also have male monsters out there, but I'm looking mostly at the lady monsters in our culture and, throughout the world. So, across cultures and centuries, we keep inventing women who are dangerous, unnatural, and terrifying. They might be witches, vampires, succubi, medusas. Medusas are actually one of my favorites, by the way. They look different, but they all seem to ask some of the same unsettling questions. What happens when a woman refuses to behave the way she's supposed to? That's really one of the main questions here. So these monstrous feminine figures tap into some deep anxieties about female power, sexuality, and autonomy. And the anxieties don't belong to just one culture or one historical moment. They're persistent, they travel around and evolve. In other words, female monstrosity doesn't just come from nowhere. It's built out of fear, and there are some unique fears that are attached that you wouldn't get with the male monster, or at least probably wouldn't get in a lot of cases. So, this is whether it's ancient myths or modern horror franchises, female monsters embody what society fears will happen if women step outside prescribed roles or embrace desires labeled dangerous or excessive. These creatures aren't just supernatural threats, they're sort of like warnings to people, right? So, let's start with one of the oldest and most familiar examples, the witch. The cackling figure riding a broomstick up in the sky, you know trying to get Dorothy's ruby slippers. The witch actually is older than that, of course, but that's one of the most popular images of a witch. And the wicked witch sort of represents fear of female wisdom and power that exists outside of male control. She's often portrayed as an older woman, unmarried, childless, and uninterested in domestic life. And instead of nurturing children, she studies herbs, commands magic, and influences the natural world itself. And according to certain, fear based incarnations of witches, they not only don't nurture children, but they actually supposedly kidnap children and use their fats in their body as parts of a magic formula to make the broomsticks fly or whatever, any number of things like that. Just a wild and crazy type of magic involved, in the witch world. And you can notice where she lives. It might be in forests, in mountains, swamps, dark places at the edge of society. The witch is sort of a misfit, an outcast, sort of like the hermit in the hills, which I've considered doing myself, but I'm not that much of a rugged outdoors type. I've still considered getting my hermit permit though, but not to be a witch, just to be clear. But the idea of being outside of society, I understand the appeal of that, and that's why I think a lot of people do understand the appeal of witches. They're also just kind of fun, like scary entities, I guess. And you know, I I think the witch is just such a fun classic horror trope, and of course it has some serious people who fear witches. Actually, they believe witches actually exist, and that witchcraft and satanic magic are a thing, and they have these images of evil women involved in that. And the witch's isolation isn't accidental. It reflects a cultural belief that women who don't marry or reproduce are somehow unnatural or aberrant. The witch is what happens when a woman chooses to live in the moment, outside of approved timelines and expectations. She's a cultural outsider, and she knows things she shouldn't, like the embodiments of these potions, these magic spells. Presumably, you could have magic incantations and possibly foreign satanic languages that she's not supposed to speak in her spells. And she wants things that she doesn't need permission to want. And for that, she becomes a monster in a way. And then there's the vampire women. Now, who doesn't like a sexy female vampire? You don't need to be a heterosexual male or a lesbian to appreciate a seductive female vampire. It's another classic horror trope. And you also have sexy male vampires, but it's a little bit different when it's a woman, right? In Bram Stoker's Dracula, Lucy Westenra's transformation is especially revealing. Before she even becomes undead, at one point she casually asks, "Why can't they let a girl marry 3 men or as many as want her and save all this trouble?" So you know she's one of those ones. Uh, it's a bit of a joke in the story, of course, in that context, but it's also a crack in the social order. She's letting her freak flag fly, if you will. And once Lucy becomes a vampire, her desire is no longer passive or polite. It's actually predatory, outright predatory. Not just seductress, but uh, a fierce force to be reckoned with. She hunts rather than waits to be chosen. She feeds on men with a hunger that's both literal and metaphorical. And that kind of makes the female vampire an interesting character in that particular instance, and of course, other incarnations of vampirism. And female vampires invert traditional gender dynamics in a way. They become the aggressors, the consumers, the ones who take without asking. Their immortality matters too, of course. Vampires don't participate in the expected cycle of marriage, reproduction, and death. They are resurrected again and again, refusing the roles that women are supposed to move through quietly. And the fear isn't just about sex, it's about sex without consequence, desire without shame, power without expiration. And if the vampire unsettles, then the succubus outright terrifies. Although I don't think there are as many movies about the succubus, or I guess there's a male equivalent called an incubus. Um, but there's an interesting aspect to this type of monster as well. The succubus most directly confronts male anxiety about female sexual agency. These demons prey on men while they sleep, when they're unconscious, exposed, and vulnerable. The encounter is erotic, or at least it's said to be, but it's also lethal. It's the ultimate reversal. Female sexuality, in this case, isn't something to be conquered or controlled. It's something that drains, consumes, and destroys. The message is clear: desire can kill you. And what makes these female monsters so powerful isn't just what they do, but what they are. They blur boundaries, human and other, natural and supernatural, victim and predator. They exist in a different space, and it makes them difficult to categorize or control, and that ambiguity is precisely the threat. So I guess, we do categorize these as monsters and as witches or whatever, but I really do think there is something to these different layers of messaging that these different types of monsters convey. And scholars of the Gothic often point out that monsters reveal more about human fears and cultural taboos than about any supernatural reality. The monster isn't the problem, the fear is. And the idea is at the heart of Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's monster theory. And in that, Cohen argues that the monster's body is a cultural body, and monsters are shaped by the anxieties of their time. They embody what a society fears, suppresses, or refuses to confront. And monsters never stay dead, at least not for very long. Even if you think you kill them, well, they're probably going to come back in one form or another. And the monster is a cultural mirror in a way. Monsters from Dracula to digital threats act as mirrors for societal anxieties regarding things like morality, science, gender, and the other, the scary, mysterious outsider. And they're not born from simple fantasy, but rise from conflict and social unease as well. So it's like a mixture of the supernatural and the absurd, and also, in some cases, some genuine social fears that people might have, especially in more, I guess, strictly conservative, orthodox sort of settings. And the monster always escapes. As Cohen notes, while a monster can be slain, it vanishes only to reappear elsewhere in a new, mutated form that reflects newer societal issues, and of course some of the same old ones. It's a new twist in a lot of cases. For example, the vampire has evolved from representing pestilence and sexual repression in the 19th century to symbolizing capitalist exploitation or disease in modern times. So, that's an interesting thing, and there are examples of. I'll give some examples of different types of monsters. I'll veer a little bit off topic here, but it's interesting to consider this in other ways too, to not just look at the female examples. There's Godzilla, for example, created in 1954. Well, Godzilla might actually be female, might be male. It's usually considered gender neutral. But, Godzilla was created as a direct response to the atomic bombings of Japan, and the creature represents the guilt, fear, and horror surrounding nuclear technology and its lasting impact. Or at least Godzilla did originally. Now it's easier to just see Godzilla as a giant lizard like monster that stomps around and, you know, crushes buildings and sometimes fights other monsters. But back in the original Godzilla, I think the messaging was a little bit more clear. And of course, some Godzilla movies have gone back to the heart of the original, including with the nuclear energy fears and that sort of thing, like the nuclear bomb type of fear. And you've got Frankenstein's monster, born in the early 1800s at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Some people say that Frankenstein's monster mirrors anxieties about scientific progress and the fear of creating life without considering the consequences. And of course, Mary Shelley was involved in the creation of Frankenstein. Well, I mean, she created Frankenstein, wasn't just involved in it. But the monster in that story, of course, has involved a lot of different themes over the years. There have been a lot of incarnations of Frankenstein's monster that really have practically nothing to do with the original novel. In fact, in the original novel, of course, the monster actually speaks. So Hollywood really kind of dumbed down the monster in a way. And of course, another fun one is zombies. Zombies have evolved from representing colonial anxieties to becoming metaphors for rampant consumerism in movies like Romero's Dawn of the Dead and the dread of being absorbed into a faceless, mindless crowd. And of course, shows like The Walking Dead and of course Romero's movies themselves also get into the general fear of what happens when society just sort of falls apart, and there's uncertainty as a result. And of course, zombies themselves, they would be scary if they were invading your town and just threatening to attack you and bite your arm or bite your throat out or whatever. It's just a scary type of idea. And then you've got like aliens and body snatchers that were very common in the 1950s. That's like one of the first incarnations of that sort of fear. And they are monsters who reflect the paranoia of the Cold War and McCarthyism, representing the fear of communist infiltration or the loss of individuality in some cases. That's what some people at least theorize that aliens and body snatchers represent. And of course, you could say it's also a grander fear of the complete unknown and having a loss of control over how society functions. And that's something you get if you look at monsters in general, like even Freddy Krueger or something like that. Freddy Krueger invades your dreams, he's invading your mind, and of course making the death inside your dream into a reality. And there's of course some metaphors there too. So, what happens to the monstrous feminine nowadays? Well, something interesting is happening, partly because of those wacky feminists. Modern interpretations have begun reclaiming some of these figures in some cases. The witch might sometimes be a symbol of feminist spirituality. The vampire becomes an expression of female rage and empowerment. The succubus, to the extent that people will talk about the succubus in a pop culture way, might be a figure of unapologetic sexual agency rather than shame or something like that. And Medusa, who again is one of my favorites, has undergone a profound reinterpretation in modern art, literature, and yes, feminist theory, shifting from a mythological monster to a symbol of female trauma, protection, and resistance. So, once portrayed as a hideous creature deserving of death, she is now more often than in the past understood as a victim of sexual assault by Poseidon, who was subsequently punished by Athena, turning her into in many ways, nasty woman or a survivor of male violence. So that's a little bit of a deeper type of approach to examining the character of Medusa. But of course, it's also kind of fun to just think of her as uh, a lady with snake hair who can turn you into stone if you look at her. And what do you know? If you hold a mirror up against her, and she looks at herself, she will turn into stone herself, or something like that. I mean, it it is fun to think about it in a more traditional sense as well. There's a lot of fun to be had with these monstrous ideas. And the monsters, in some cases they're not just warnings, but they might be, an example of a broadening understanding or society wanting to take a story that was originally simpler and make it more complex and have a different take on things. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, so long as sometimes people at least study and understand what the more older ideas were about. And a shift doesn't mean the fear disappears. It means the meaning changes. Monsters are not fixed in time. They're cultural reflections, constantly reshaped by who holds power and who resists it. And of course, also by you if you are a creator. And these are, in many cases, very general concepts that you can play around with if you are trying to create like a vampire story or a new twist on Medusa or any number of these different stories that might happen to be in public domain. So ultimately, the monsters we create tell us more about ourselves than about the dark, By examining them, we uncover our deepest unspoken worries, our contradictions, our unresolved crises, and so on and so forth. And when it comes to female monsters, the question has always been less about the supernatural and more about control because of the politics involved, the gender politics. So, the questions are who gets to want, who gets to live outside the rules, and who gets punished for it. And, sometimes you ask those questions in other contexts as well. For example, a president might be able to get away with piracy, actually stealing an oil tanker, and at the same time, he might demonize a Somali pirate. It's a very contradictory world full of hypocrisies and weirdness, and you know that's a real life monster I was talking about right there. Um, you know, that's a I suppose for another more political episode, but I don't know. For some reason, it just seemed relevant here for me to delve into that. So, anyway, tell me what your thoughts are on these topics. Which is your favorite female monster, and which is your favorite more traditional view of that monster, and your most favorite relatively apolitical version, and maybe what is your most favorite politicized version of one of these monsters. All right, so that's about it for the episode. Hit like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. Have a good day.